Thank you very much. I'm more fortunate than most people. I have already lived, and I'm old enough and secure enough not to get angry because people don't like what I'm going to say. At least a month before the march, I was one of the first people to say that the march was a ceremony, a waste of time, and a Farrakhan con game. I said it because I know Farrakhan, and I know other con games that he's played. My remarks will be centered around Farrakhan, a faker, Malana Karenga, another faker, and the word atonement. I don't have to defend my political relationships because I have been a political left radical for most of my life, and I have been a severe critic of the left for most of my life, and for which I have no apologies. Now, the Million Man March was an achievement. An achievement for who and for what? Anytime you gather that many people together and the speeches last 4 and 5 hours and you do not bring Africa in focus, in relationship to the African people of the world, you are out of order. You might as well talk about a child without talking about its mother and its father. Now, let's look at the intent of Farrakhan, and let's look at a serious disease in our community that plagues Farrakhan as well as others, and that is ego starvation. We are lacking in a special kind of stoking that makes us secure. Let's look at the fact that Malcolm X was a tutor of Farrakhan, and he turned on Malcolm X and said that Malcolm X was a traitor to the nation, and the nation had a right to punish him. Now, can you trust in leadership people who would turn on a friend? I have said many times, if Farrakhan would sell one of his stretch limousines, he could send a black student through medical school. You have gathered to aggrandize a faker who is not accountable to you for anything. He has not accounted to you for the $5 million he got from Libya. Libya is part of the fundamentalist Arab clique who wants to Islamize Africa or destroy it. Who congratulated him after the march? Libya and a high politician from Iran. Libya has been instigating to move to the south into the great corridor that is Sudan. If you take the Sudan, that corridor gives you a straight shot into South Africa, and Libya will join the whites to reconquer Africa. They have no compunction about it because they do not think of themselves as an African people, and like all conquerors, conquerors, they declared war on all forms of African culture. Because Farrakhan belongs to fundamentalist and reactionary Islam, he knows nothing about revolutionary Islam, that is African Islam. In Arab Islam, no woman ever held state power. In African Islam, women not only held state power, but in African Islam, women are the masters of the marketplace. Go to West Africa right now. Most of the concessions are controlled by women. Go to East Africa where you find African Islam. It's man-controlled. Because the Arabs destroyed the matrilineal and installed the patrilineal. Farrakhan has not answered to us. For some things we should have obviously asked some questions about. After the Million Man March, the Caribbean News had a headline hailing the march in the triumph of the West Indian Farrakhan. How did Farrakhan suddenly become a West Indian? He wasn't born there. Why are you emphasizing his West Indianness now? He ain't got no West Indian support. Why did you let Farrakhan get away with saying repeatedly the slave ships stopped in the West Indies and left the strong ones and brought the weaker ones over here, which is a lie, which proves he has no knowledge of how the slave trade operates. Why don't you know enough about your history to know how this trade operated? After the American Yankee Clipper outran the British man of war, and slavery was a New England business, not a Southern business. The Southerners bought their slaves from the New Englander. After that, American ships went straight to Africa, picked up the slaves, and came straight back to the United States. You cannot separate slaves based on who was brave and who was not brave. The slave revolts in the Caribbean islands were more successful, had nothing to do with bravery. It had to do with an incident in history which neither one of us had anything to do with. The maintenance of culture continuity. Slaves, buyers in the Caribbean bought in large lots and kept the lots together. They thought they could work them better that way, but they forgot they could revolt better that way. In the Caribbean islands, the slave in the house related to the slaves in the field. In the United States, because they bought in small lots and broke them out, the slave in the house had no relationship to the slave in the field, and the slave in the house would betray the slave in the field. This had nothing to do with bravery. It has to do with culture continuity. There are good books on the subject by fine Caribbean writers, especially Eric Williams and C.L.R. James. So what is he talking? Distorting history, and he get away with it because you don't know history. In a speech made right here in New York, Farrakhan bought the story of the curse and said, and I've got it on tape, I got it on video, and I got it on audio, that people with dark skin and woolly hair, a certain kind of nose, was cursed. And that the texture of your hair and the texture of your eyebrows are supposed to be the same. He's saying with his high yellow self that he is pretty and blessed by God. to say? He's saying with his high yellow self that he is pretty and blessed by God. And you're buying it, applauding it, and following after this con man. Now you would follow him to Washington. It was an achievement. An achievement for who? Anytime you gather that many people together and fail to mention Africa, you might as well build a body and leave out the heart. No matter where your body is in this world, your political and cultural heartbeat is in Africa. You call him Italian American. He's not pleased. He calls himself Italian. He's been here 5 generations. He still says Italian. He mentioned the country of his origin. His Americanism is a giver. But the country of his origin is his birthright. Why have we listened to all of this with no perception? His speech indeed was a golden opportunity. And he said nothing, put it all together. It's like a Baptist sermon. I have put Baptist sermons, recorded them, and had them transcribed. The minister is not saying nothing. Not one good sentence there. He's babbling, and once in a while he said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Then he turns to the audience and says, do I have a witness? Witness for what? You ain't said nothing. And we let people get away with this feel-good rhetoric and run games on us and open up our pockets and put money in the collection plate and go out and say, oh, what a fine sermon. He ain't said nothing. Farrakhan is a frustrated Baptist preacher like most of the Muslims. They're angry with Christianity. Now, I challenge Farrakhan to march on the Arab embassies that has restarted the slave trade in Africa, in the Sudan, and in Mauritania. If he and the rest of the Muslims are not ready to deal with the slave trade in Africa, they're cowards and hypocrites. In the new slave trade in Africa, they're not only killing African men, they're working African women in the field in the day and using them sexually at night. Their children are being trained as prostitutes and concubines. Their young men mutilated. Africans are being driven out of Mauritania who are Muslims because they not only want this to be a Muslim country, an Arab Muslim country. Farrakhan hasn't said one word about this because he is bought and paid for by fundamentalist Arabs. And tell him to prove me wrong. Tell anybody to prove me wrong. Why has he had nothing to say about that? And you following him like a fool to Washington. Go to Washington if you want to go to Washington. But don't go around following a faker to Washington. It's an achievement, but an achievement for what? He hadn't accounted to you for the $5 million he got from Libya. Now, let us, just for instance, 1 million men, let's guide on 1 million, although we could have been more, and each one spent at least $100. Add $100 together 1 million times. Do you know we can buy supermarkets all over this country? We got nursing homes. Nobody have to come and run our communities. I'm not a capitalist. I've never owned a car. I made a halfway decent salary as a college professor and as a writer and lecturer. I never owned a car. I always had a fascination for shoes, so I got too many shoes. I came from sharecropper background in Alabama, and I've never disassociated myself with the working class. And I've always had some disagreement with the left, and still have it, because I think some of them are a bunch of fakers. I believe in total African liberation. But the program of the white left is no different from the program of the white right, to control by any means necessary. That's why in London recently there was 3 Pan-African meetings. I attended the all-black one because the 2 white ones want to integrate to the point of helping the African in sharing. Africa don't share anything in Europe, power-wise. I'd be willing to share with Europeans in Africa only to the extent that they're willing to share with us in Europe. I want to see in Africa as African control as Europe is European control, but not the same way. I have no problem about all governments supposed to be controlled by its people. If you don't take care of the very old, the very young, the poor, and the sick, and the needy, you have no government or anything worth being called a government at all. Now we are confronting things now. When are we going to confront Farrakhan? When are we going to confront him on the way he has addressed himself to our physical being? The whole concept of the curse wasn't in the Bible originally. It was drug in later. And whosoever drug it in and assigned it to God is a lie on God, because gods do not curse. That will make him ungodly. Now, let's go to the other faker who wrote the mission statement. There is nothing in the mission statement that is new. There's nothing in the mission statement that hasn't been said before. And yet he's selling the mission statement out of a press he found called the University of Sangaree Press. He has no knowledge of the University of Sangaree, which was the university in Timbuktu. He has no knowledge of the great intellectual age at Sangay. And yet he claims that he literally, Karinga acted as though he has rewritten the Bible and did a better job than the original writers. He has not atoned to the community for his attempt to destroy the Panther movement. He has not atoned for being a police informer. He has not atoned for the way he treated black women. And look now, the women he mistreated and mutilated were dark in complexion. The women in his harem are light in complexion. The number 1 woman is a Mexican with what seemed to be an Afro wig. He not only has a color problem, he's got an ego problem too. When he travels, he rarely lives in the black community. And someone offered him some good, well-prepared black food, and he said he'd rather have someone offer them some good, well-prepared black food, and he said he'd rather have a Big Mac with his little stuffy pig-like self. He deserved a Big Mac. In Egypt, he showed absolute contempt for black people. He and his harem and his bodyguard, all on the expense of the organization, was separate on the bus, separate living quarters, ate separate, didn't associate with the rest of us, got on the bus is going to a place called Memphis, and he asked the bus driver, why must we go to Memphis? What's there to be seen? That proved he is ignorant of African history. Memphis was the world's first metropolis before Giza. They tore down most of Memphis to build some of the other cities. And he asked, what's in Memphis? He goes to one of the sacred temples. Now, we who go to Egypt a lot know that certain things we do not do because out of respect. He goes to the Holy of Holies. This is the prayer room of the Pharaoh, the God Pharaoh, the God King or God Pharaoh. This is the prayer room where the Pharaoh, dressed in special clothing, oils himself, even removes all of his pubis hairs so he can be totally sanitized, and sets in praise not only for himself, but praise for the nation. We make a special point of never going inside of these rooms out of respect for these ancient Africans who had great spirituality long before some foreigner baker and food found something called religion. Karinga goes in there with his shoes on and with one of the women of his harem pose for a picture, to have his picture taken. Now you're going to follow this man who's shown utter contempt for African people. Follow him where? In Senegal, he got a lot of dandruff because I was elected head of the American group. The Senegalese, who know that I've related to the Francophone community more and better than any African in the whole of the Western world, and contributed more to their publications over the years, didn't think it was necessary to consult anyone to elect me head of the group. Karinga is now having a fit about it. When we arrived at the next assignment, he came over to me and said, I did not know the definition of his name. Malana means God. And he resented the fact that I arrived in a car and the rest of them was on a bus. Now, with all the diplomats I knew when they were students in Paris, and with my connection in Dakar, even the beggars know me by first name. You think I can't get a car in Dakar? So it's nothing extraordinary for me to arrive at the assembly in a car. His number one lady, a Mexican, in shawls, very beautiful decorative shawls. But the Africans don't like women in shorts, period. With her camera taking the pictures of the legislative council, no permission, and the pictures of all the people attending the conference. We don't know what she's going to do with those pictures. Karinga telling her what pictures to take, make sure she don't miss nobody. Now Karinga has a catalog of everybody who attended that conference, with no permission. His Husir is a poor rewrite of ancient African text. This man has never accounted to us for this betrayal. He writes a mission statement. Now, if Farrakhan had stood before that audience and just said, I want to call your attention to a 19th century messenger who spoke better than I have ever spoken or maybe ever will, and just read David Walker's appeal and sit down, that would have been enough. For David Walker said more than Farrakhan ever have said or ever will say. Have you called attention to Chancellor Williams' message at the end of his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, his master plan? That would have been enough. Or Sheikh Anta Diop's message for economic salvation in a little book called Black Africa, the Politics of a Federated State. That would have been enough. We have had great messengers. And we come down now and glorify fakers, women mutilators, liars, people who ridicule us about our color. We make them millionaires, give them stretch limousines, and they spit on us.
That's right.
I'm saying that we have to reward true and honest leadership. I do not believe that any program for African people can afford to leave out Pan-Africanism, African world nationalism, and the values of a traditional African society, because if you search the values of a traditional African society, they had socialism not only before Karl Marx was born, but before Europe was born. And if Karl Marx said this was primitive, Karl Marx was a liar and a mistaken, misguided European. It was not primitive. It worked. It worked because they built societies that had no word for jail because no one had ever gone to one. They built societies that had no social agencies because no one had needed one. In a meeting, 10 or more, 3 or more of African people, if Africa is not brought into proper focus in relationship to the African people of the world, the meeting is out of order. And any meeting that accepts us as a minority is out of order. When you take all of the African people in the Western world, all of the African people in the Pacific, 100 million African people in India, 750 million African people in Africa, we number 1 billion people on the face of this earth. Suppose we decided just to make our underwear. Look at the kind of factories we'd have to open overnight. Just underwear. Then next, let's start to make our shoes. We can employ 2/3 of our people just taking care of each other. All we have to do is to turn to each other. Look in the mirror and find a partner. See who's staring back at you. We can discard the Farrakhan's, the Karingas, other fakers, believe in ourselves. And let us understand that the Baptists alone take in more money than 7 European nations. You haven't asked what happened to this money. We have failed to demand accountability. We have to do this. We can make a revolution, and we can be the leaders of that revolution. And remember, the people must be taken care of. I'm not talking about giving money to loafers who are not working. I'm talking about giving money to people who deserve. Most people will work if you could find it for them. And I'm talking about finding jobs, sustaining each other. finding jobs, making bread for each other, making clothes for each other, repairing each other's homes and preparing your own home. I'm saying move like a nation, think like a nation, and supply for yourself everything that goes into the making of a nation. I see no future in capitalism. I've fought it all my life, and I don't even have to argue this point. I see no future for capitalism in Africa. You go to Washington, appeal into corporations, and corporations got their seed money from the slave trade. It's too much of a contradiction. You're big enough, build your own corporation. Build your own corporations devoted to your own needs. And not a corporation bleeding people dry. Building a corporation and develop a society based on socialistic values is not incompatible. And yet I think there's a form of nationalism that is wasting our time. There's a form of nationalism essential to our existence. I'm not too clear what a cultural nationalist is. Most people you call narrow nationalists, I just call nationalist parasites and fools. Just hustlers, con men. I will end this by saying that there is no future for African people except some corporation for themselves, and our own salvation must come first. I'm saying you can give the world a new humanity. I do not think you can exist in this world out of context with the rest of the world. I think you should need to form a partnership, not only with the white working class, but with all the working classes of the world. I do not think that any working class of any country or culture can exist and abstain from some concern for the other working classes of the world. I see no hope for capitalism except a new form of fascism, more ruthless than anything we've seen before. Let's go back to atonement and let's start. What are we atoning for? Let's have some understanding about it. If you read Shekanta Diop's The Culture, Unity of Black Africa, there was no wife beating in Africa. There was no female disrespect in Africa. We were drafted against our will into a society that had fear of women. We had no fear of women in an African society. We knew she was the life giver. In most African societies, men rose each morning and prostrated themselves at the door of their mother and did not rise until she said, "Accept my blessings, precious fruit of my womb." These same men who paid this kind of respect to their mother turned out to be the fiercest warriors Africa ever knew. So there's strength in paying respect to the woman that gave you birth. We had no confusion about this. We developed this confusion away from home. You would no beat up no woman in Africa. You might do it now because Africans are confused now. When you married someone in Africa, you married her family and she married yours. If you want to deal with 50 cousins, 100 uncles, if you can deal with all of that, then go ahead. Then we came out of a collective society. We have forgotten what made Africa great. before foreigners threaten their greatness. High morality and collective discipline. Somehow, we have to find the road that leads us back to that Africa. Thank you very much.
Tell no lies and claim no easy victories. Thank you, John Henrik Clark. I guess we can move to the question and answer period right now, for those of you who might have some questions. You know, this kind of, I don't, you're going to set up a mic out here? Want some water?
No,
Okay. John Henrik Clark will be back in just a moment. But, you know, this kind of discussion is one that needs to go on. It used to go on all the time in our community when we had individuals around like W.E.B. Du Bois. Malcolm made most of his reputation, and he got better known because of debates, and he was willing to debate anyone about any subject, particularly around the subject of the liberation of black people. So I think that we have to look at it in that light, that we need to bring up some serious questions and analyze what it is that we're going through, what it is we're in the midst of, so that we can come up with some answers and move forward. There's still some questions that need to be raised. I'm hoping that in the future, the Nation of Islam would be open to coming out and not assuming that every question that's raised is an attack on the nation. That we all have questions that we need to wind up working out so we can all be on the same page, so we can move forward. So I hope that in the future they will be willing to come out and engage in those kinds of discussions. So I guess they're going to set up a mic over here. Okay. I guess they're going to set up a mic, so if you have any questions, John Henrik Clark will be back in just a moment. So if you have a question for him, you can hold on to that. It's like a puzzle. I don't know what happened to your trees. She must be the place making a sandwich. Maybe I beat her up so bad in that music contest that she so crowded that you had a tendency to go and try and find someplace that wasn't crowded. But it was a magnificent spectacle still to see all of those people come together without a single arrest, without anybody even hollering and screaming at each other. So please, if you do have some questions, would you come up to the microphone, and we'll do our best to to the mic.
I just wanted to ask a question. You know, I go to these meetings and I keep hearing about capitalism and socialism, and we never really talk about how do we amass capital. Whether you're a socialist or a capitalist, you still need capital. So we're in the same 30, 40-year rhetoric. I've been living in this community and hearing this same recrimination. This one said this one did. It's all nonsense. We've got to begin to move on. We're living past 30, 40 years over and over every single day. It's ridiculous. It's time for us to move on. In this community, I grew up in this particular area, and it's time for us to stop going back to 1962 and what Karenga said, and what Huey Newton said, and what Eldridge Cleaver said. Let's move on. Those people are gone. A lot of them are dead. The movement moves on.
I don't know what the question was. I don't know what the question was. It sounded more like a statement. But I think the purpose of what we're here for today, you talk about Huey Newton's dead and things. Obviously these issues haven't been resolved, because if they had been effectively resolved in a principled way, then Ron Karenga wouldn't have been the drafter of the mission statement. You know, so these words are not about rhetoric. We talk about, well, what's the difference? Capitalism, we need to move on. With any movement, whether it's a social movement that we're talking about, if we're talking about in our personal lives, there has to be a moment in which there is some accounting, some accountability. And that's what we're talking about, because you talked about people being dead. That's true. There are certain people that are dead, but there were also reactionary forces that were allowed to actually gain prominence after the counterintelligence program effectively destroyed the Black liberation movement in this country. And you know what they say? Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. So, you know, Farrakhan just didn't drop out of anywhere. He has a history. And this sort of like impatience with, you know, involving and engaging in a critical analytical process is not going to help us to move forward in our struggle in a meaningful way. We have to learn from our mistakes of the past. When we're talking about capitalism, I don't care what you want to call it. I'm talking about an economic system which is based on the exploitation of the majority of people for the benefit of a few. We're living inside of a country where over 90% of the wealth is controlled by less than 5% of the population. How do we move beyond that reality? How do we do it? Do we just will ourselves into moving beyond it? And capitalism is about a certain relationship, a relationship of how you view people. I'm not a capitalist because black folks were the first capital in this country, okay? I'm not with any system that's based on the exploitation. So yeah, we got to start somewhere, and part of the starting point is analyzing. There has not been, as Dr. Clark stated, any kind of atonement, any kind of day of reckoning. Why isn't Farrakhan here right now answering these very questions? He's not accountable to anybody. I'm sure Libya gave him another $5 or $10 million. How do we move forward when we're not going to talk? Dr. Clark mentioned specific ways that we can begin to move on. We can begin to move on by taking control of our communities. But we can't be idealistic about how that process begins, because anytime we begin to get power, we're going to come up against political repression. You want to forget about brothers who right now, like Mumia Abu-Jamal, if it wasn't for people organizing, he would have been dead right now. Okay? So I'm not willing to forget those people who gave their lives for the community, whether you agree with their politics or not. I can't go on when I know, you know, Herman Bell is sitting up right now, 23 hours keep locked, because he dared to protest a double bunking policy, and this brother gave his life for the black community. No, I cannot go on. He is with me every single day of my life, and I'm struggling to do the best that I can to help liberate people every day and make a contribution to my community.
I have a question. I would like to know your thoughts on this. And the question is basically a statement, and then you can give me your thoughts on that yourself and Professor Clark. And the question goes as follows. I believe that the big question black people has to answer is not whether we are real men. That is not the question. The real question we have to deal with is what is the correct strategy to use to free us from oppression. I believe that we have been doing the wrong thing in going for self. And I have an example of that, and that is that, as many of us know about, during the 40s and early 50s, many of our people left the South in search of jobs. So what we had is that many men left the South in search of jobs, and they left their families in the South. Now, what we had then is a number of men in the North who were going for self and seeking a job, and then you had all these families in the South who were left basically unprotected because the men were in the North. So we have all these unprotected families in the South, men going for self in the North, and our oppressors, the racists, they were able to terrorize us in the South, and they were able to terrorize us in the North because each individual man was going for self and saying, well, I'm up here looking for a job in order to support my family, so therefore I cannot involve myself in any effort to protect the community from the racist whites who were in the North. So because of that situation, the racists were able to terrorize us in the South and terrorize us in the North, and right now we are faced with the situation that we are dealing with today. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
This is a situation, but I think you've dramatized it well, and you've also overstated it. But the basis for being terrorized is much bigger than that. We were going to be terrorized with or without the men, or with or without the change, with or without the migration. So the basis would have been some form of economic stability, where we would not have to relocate so often, but had some where we were. We could have come south or go north. What's the reason? But we should not have had to go solely for economic reasons. The problem is, was then as it is now. We have no built-in securities that we can use, but we do not have to call on other people. And I've always said this is possible because if we built in a system of self-reliance, and there's so many jobs we can create among us that would take up some of the economic slack. And I'm not talking about becoming mass capitalists, but becoming a people who literally take care of their own. What I'm talking about is a form of internal socialism. Now, you may or not understand